Okay, great. Thank you. My name's Toby Smith. I'm one of the lecturers at UEA in Physio, and for my sins, I'm currently the hub lead for CAHPR East Anglia. For those of you that don't know, the idea of CAHPR really is to encourage and to support and to help people who want to be more research active, whether that's people who are interested in knowing a bit more about research, integrating research into their clinical practice, or following a research career and being a more active researcher. It's really that link between higher education and clinical practice, and it's supported by the vast majority of AHP bodies and councils in the UK at the moment. Okay, so on behalf of CAHPR, this session's about writing for publication. Okay. So what I'm hopefully going to cover in the next 40 minutes or so is these points. So first of all, why do we publish? Why is it important to publish? And also, well, what's relevant to publish? Which is often the starting point about, when embarking upon this. We'll look at aspects of the team, because I very much believe that we're experts in our field, but it's very useful to use other people and other people's expertise and bounce ideas off other people. So thinking about a team for your papers and for your work. Developing a question, where to submit the paper, the thorny issue about whether your project, your paper needs ethical approval or not. We'll try to deconstruct that because it's forever changing, but just knowing bits about that. Then how to write, which is probably the hardest thing in a way, but how do we report, how do we write? Then that perennial question about, well, how long does it take, vaguely. We'll talk about peer review and the notion about what to expect from a peer review process, but also things that are helpful to know from a peer review process when preparing your papers before getting to that point. And then dissemination. Once that paper's out, how do we spread the word? Okay. As I said before, if you've got any questions, then please interrupt me. I'm more than happy to be interrupted. So, first of all, should I bother? So, this whole session really are what I've learnt and my own personal views, okay? So I'm happy to be contradicted at any point, but I'm a big believer that papers and publications are really important for clinical academics, for clinicians or academics, whatever. I think if you've got a question, or if you've got a topic or a service or a case or a piece of work that you've done, such as a literature review or a trial or a study, if you've gone to the trouble to do that, it must be important to you, so chances are it'll be important to somebody else. Save them the trouble of going through all the hardship that you do and give them the answer in 3,000 words. It means that they can use that to inform their clinical practice, but also it means that they can answer some other question with their time that would also advance knowledge. So this idea that people do a study and then put it on the shelf and leave it there to catch dust and never to see the light of day really scares me, because actually you've spent a year of your life potentially. Why don't you try to spread that so that someone else doesn't need to spend a year of their life, they can do something else to advance knowledge. So actually dissemination is critically important. We should be publishing. We should get that message out. It's hard to do, but hopefully at the end of this it won't feel so scary. Credibility to change practice is massive. So some people won't change their clinical practice. So some service managers, some colleagues, some commissioners won't change practice or pathways unless there's some form of validation. And a paper is some form of validation. It's been peer reviewed, it's been agreed that actually it's a rigorous piece of work or has some merit. So therefore you could use that as ammunition, so to speak, to start a debate or a dialogue between changing service, if that's an example. So in my own clinical practice, I still work clinically as well as academically. We're changing or looking towards changing our practice on hip precautions after hip replacement, for instance, which are tried and tested things, always happened. Some of the clinical colleagues won't change their practice unless they've got some form of evidence to change, which is completely sensible. So a paper might be used to start that dialogue to change practice. So I think it's quite important. You can use it in your benefit. whatever happens, whatever the outcome of your paper, it can be used to stimulate the debate. So it might be that your paper is a foundation to knowledge. So you might say, okay, this is what we currently know. So let's then discuss that. Well, what does that relate to in our patient group? Should we be doing something different, or does this reinforce what we should be doing anyway? So you can use it almost as, again, ammunition to start a debate and looking at your own practices and services. So that can be useful. But also I think the last 2 points that are quite important. It's challenging to write papers, and sometimes challenging both academically but also to find the time to do that in people's normal clinical practice and their normal lives. So sometimes actually taking the challenge is really rewarding from a personal career progression, but also personal interest and challenge. And I know some people feel very favourably that to tick certain boxes on promotions, for instance, that a paper may help their arguments in clinical practice. It might show that outward CPD has been tangibly achieved with a paper publication as well. So, in a slightly more, personal point of view, it might be that the publication has numerous merits as well as from a clinical practice point of view. So, I suppose the big question is, well, what's relevant? Because if the topic's relevant, then it should get published, because if it's relevant to you, chances are, as I said before, is it'd be relevant to other people. Deciding what's relevant is difficult, and when I was thinking about this slide, I was really thinking, well, I suppose we have two options. We have, well, what's relevant clinically, and what's relevant from a methodological design process research perspective. So clinically interesting things might be an intervention or a service that is new and novel. So maybe your service or your interventions have had to change for whatever reason, and that might be different to your clinical practice, and you might want to spread that message across other regions or other countries, for instance. So this change of practice you could report there. So it might be that intervention's different. It might be that actually you've always done something and you're starting to question that. So you might want to look at all the evidence in a systematic review, for instance, to say, okay, this is what we're doing currently, but does that reflect what could be done? Okay, to start questioning that. As I said, it could be that you've had to change your service provision, either, as we've discussed before, about changing provisional needs, changing healthcare practices. The difference between healthcare and social services, for instance, might be changing how we provide services, and that might be reported as well, which might be useful. And then finally, as healthcare professionals, whatever professional practice, we have inquiring minds. We always question what we're doing and reflect on that. And actually, those reflections and those opinions are really quite useful pieces of work. And finally, the non-clinical, I suppose, type relevant papers might be about methodological interest. So designing a study or designing a service, I suppose, evaluating a tool or an outcome measure, or something like that might have merit as well, might be useful. I think anything that you think, actually, I'm prepared to spend the next few months, 6 months, a year on this, chances are you've decided, well, that's important, so therefore it will be important to other people. Okay? And we'll talk about which journals might fit that relevance in a bit. So I think really early on, I think it's quite important to think about, well, who can help me answer this thing that I want to look at? Okay? So everyone sat in this room will have the things that they're good at, and they will have those skills. But likewise, I think we can also say, well, we feel less comfortable doing this, okay? Or I know someone else who knows a bit more about that, okay? Happy, come in. So developing the team's really, really useful. And so that might be clinical expertise. So it might be that you have expertise in one area, but your topic or your paper might have expertise in a slightly different area as well. So I suppose the example I'm doing at the moment is I'm looking at orthopedic surgery and the use of giving a medication to reduce blood loss after surgery, for instance. I'm not a surgeon, I'm not a haematologist, but I know about recovery after a hip fracture, for instance. So I feel comfortable about that, but there's other two aspects of my question I'm going to have to get expertise clinically to help me inform that. So thinking about what aspects might be useful to help inform those is quite important. If we're thinking about doing a research project, which we hope to go on to publish, then thinking, well, who can help me design this project? Okay? So that could be from a quantitative perspective, it could be from a qualitative perspective. It might be liaising and discussing with the clinical trials unit, for instance. That might be useful in that perspective. And secondly to that, I suppose it's those people that have specialist skills, again, to be able to analyse your data or help you answer your research question. They may be statistical, they may be health economics, they may be process evaluation, where we're looking at a pathway and evaluating the successes and failings, but also the context of where that's working and not. So they're all key collaborators. The other group of people that might be important to your team and your paper might be stakeholders. So that could be commissioners, for instance. That might be people in Public Health England or the Department of Health might have a view to input and help with that. But also service users. So the view of the service user, of your patients, might be really important because they'll look at things in a completely different perspective, potentially. They might be on completely similar, but it might be looking at the same aspect but with a different lens because of their role in that partnership between patient and therapist. And then finally for academic awards, so a number of people will start their first papers in relation to educational awards, and actually having that academic supervisor is useful. And in this stage, when you're thinking about publication, that academic supervisor's role may be slightly different. So when you're doing a master's or a PhD or a BSc or whatever the educational award is, there's that case where the lecturer or the academic acts to facilitate your knowledge and your learning. Once that award's over, then you can use the educational supervisor to actually help in developing that paper, because it's not for an educational award, so they can have a greater role in helping to write and helping to facilitate that. So the role changes slightly post-educational award. The key thing is for all five of these groups is to use them. Okay, so there is a tendency where the lead person who writes the paper does all the work. Well, I'd argue that probably isn't the best thing, because I've said, well, these people have different skills which are really important to be able to develop your paper. Use them, okay? Ask them to write, ask them to critique, ask them to add in, use their expertise most appropriately, rather than just being we don't want to bother them because they're really, really busy. Use them. They're potential authors on your paper, so really make the most of those. And then there'll also be people who help, who assist, who give guide, who might review your papers, and again, it's worth acknowledging them, but maybe not contributing to the same extent that your team would be from a co-author perspective. Right, so what type of papers could I write? So these will vary depending on what you're looking at and what your questions are. So they range from the first column on your left, which is case studies, commentaries, opinion pieces, service improvement reports and literature reviews. These might be standalone papers, which might be a really good starting point, okay, when thinking about writing. If we take the bottom part, the bottom points around health economic analysis, trials, qualitative studies and mixed method studies, where we're taking quant and qual results, generally we need to have some form of funding for those studies. Okay, so they're often part of a research program or a research study, which will require a degree of funding. So from a first step on getting on the publication ladder, you might find the first options are more facilitatory type way. You might be able to access those far easier than the latter. What we'll discuss in the subsequent slides relates to both of these, but I'd say starting points might be the case study and the literature review. And I know when we encourage people to start writing, we'd encourage those two parts really. The key thing, I suppose, is whatever type of paper we're designing and whatever type of paper we're going to write, is that we have a clear question. Okay? If we have a clear question, we can start and we can develop that paper with the aim of answering that question. But also, it's the first thing that your reader's going to look at with that paper. And if your question isn't clear, they're going to get lost. And that paper really is going to be very difficult to interpret. Okay? So having a clear question is essential. So really, the crux of it is what you're trying to answer. And to structure that, we'll often use the PICOT, so the P being population, the I being intervention, the C being a comparison, the O being the outcome, and the T being time. So these are the 5 elements that are really valuable to have somewhere within your question. So the population could be anything about the people who you're interested in looking at and investigating. The I, if it is a treatment or an intervention, then that might be very clear. You can document there. Exposure refers to the context. So if it wasn't an intervention, but it was being in an environment or being upon a pathway, which could be, I suppose, be interpreted as an intervention, then we'd have that there. You may or may not have a comparison within your research question. So it might be that, yes, you want to compare one approach to a different approach, or it might be actually you just want to look at the outcomes of this one approach before and after the treatment, for instance, or whatever the case may be. So you may or may not have that comparison. But having somewhere in your question some idea of outcome is important. And when we consider outcome in the question, we probably refer to our primary or most important outcome measure. Now again, we can be very specific on that. So it might be something as specific as quality of life with a certain measure. It might be pain, for instance. It might be educational attainment. Or it could be something very global, such as clinical outcomes, complications, health economic outcomes. So it really can be as narrow as broad. Again, when we think of outcome, as I said, in your title, in your question, you'd have that primary outcome measure, but you also, somewhere in your paper, you might have other secondary outcome measures, 3, 4, or 5 other outcomes that are important to you, important to your reader, be that a stakeholder, be that a patient, be that a clinician, whoever. And finally, the time. Again, you may or may not specify a time in your question. You might be interested in looking at short-term outcomes, might be longer-term outcomes, whatever is important or not. But you sometimes see the time, you sometimes don't. Very, very early on, so really probably at the point where you've got your question, think about where you're going to submit. Okay. Now, some people, when they're writing their paper, will write their paper, will have it finished, and then they'll think about where to submit. Okay, and that's fine. Other people will encourage you, as I'm doing today, think about location first. What that does is, first of all, it tells you about what type of outcomes, what type of message that journal's trying to portray across. So if you know, okay, I'm doing this, I'm going to answer this question, and I want as many people as possible who are going to be interested about that topic to read that. Now, you will individually know in your professional groups what the journal is that's going to have that most exposure. Because that's the aim of it, really, is that the message is going to go to the right people, to as many people as possible. So your paper might be perfectly fit to the British Journal of Occupational Therapy, for instance. And that might be, yes, that's the message, because I know all the UK occupational therapists will have access to that. My message will get across, and it's most likely to have an impact there. So you'll know the type of outcomes that they're interested in. You'll know the types of people that they're interested in. So if you know that that's where you want it to go to, then that might inform the design of the study, not the paper, which might be important because it might modify the people that you're going to look at. So if you've found, let's say, a topic that you're really interested in looking at all the evidence for, so you're going to do a systematic review of the literature, let's say, for this intervention that you think is quite important, you might vary your population of that systematic review or the specific outcomes to meet that journal because you want it to go to that journal. Okay. So thinking about that early on is quite important because it will have an impact potentially on the design of your study. But what it will also do is it'll have an impact on the design of your paper. So if we take the example BJOT, for instance, there will be a certain format that journal uses. There'll be certain titles and subheadings that journal uses. There'll be a way that they present the results. There'll be a way that they present the text. And actually formatting to look like that's really important as well. Because when they come to review it, when the peer reviewers come to review it and the editorial team comes to review it, if it looks like and feels like a BJOT paper, they're going to feel more comfortable that, yes, this is a BJOT paper. Our readers will like it. It's going to be of value to them, and that's really, really important. So when you choose your journal, think about the topic, think about who's going to read it. Because if you submit a paper to a journal that is a really good journal but isn't really for the readers of your topic, it will get rejected pretty quickly. Because the editor will come back and say, look, lovely paper, but actually doesn't fit the type of people who read our journal. So it's better, there's a better home for this paper to have a bigger impact. Okay? So think of your topic. The question is it nature or is it non-nature? So nature being the all-singing, all-dancing, great paper, great journal, has big impact, everyone reads it. Versus journals that aren't so well known, maybe not so popular, and maybe where the papers are not so rigorous, I suppose, if we want to name, potentially. So thinking about where is the home for this paper? And I often use the phrase aim high and work down. Okay? So in publications, chances are you will get rejected. Okay? That's fairly, because it's very competitive. So depending on your journal, the acceptance rate might be anywhere between potentially 100%, but I'm yet to find the journal that has a 100% acceptance rate, anywhere down to 5%. Okay, and depending on the journal that you submit, depends on where it goes. And the reason for that is because of the number of pages that journal will have. They can't take every paper on board. It depends on how many acceptance, how many submissions they get per year. Various different reasons for that. So it might be an incredibly good paper, but actually, when weighing up in relation to all the other submissions, they just can't take your paper. There's not enough room for that paper. But if you aim high, with the idea that the better journals will have the greatest readership, so therefore have the greatest impact of your paper, and work down, I think it's probably the appropriate way to go. And we talked about designing the paper and possible design of the study as well. So one of the most difficult and thorny questions is, do I need ethical approval? So I've tried to break the different types of papers really into three groups here. The systematic reviews, the commentaries and opinion pieces, I would say you can feel quite comfortable that you don't need ethical approval for these types of papers. Okay? So systematic reviews or literature reviews, you're taking the literature. You're having no patient contact whatsoever. You're not approaching human beings. You're taking paper and you're looking at the results of that paper. You're hoping that the individual studies that you're reviewing have got ethical approval, but actually that doesn't matter for your paper. So there's no ethical approval needed for that. Commentaries and opinion pieces likewise. Okay, it's your views, it's your opinions. You do not have to ask for ethical approval to be able to write down your views and opinions. Obviously, as health professionals, you respect confidentiality and anonymity if you make any reference to anyone, but you do not need ethical approval for those types of papers. Clinical trials and research projects. So this is where you're approaching human beings when you wouldn't normally approach human beings. Okay, you're asking them to do or putting them through something that isn't standard. Okay, you would always have to get ethical approval for that, quite rightly. So it's important that we safeguard human beings and don't do anything inappropriate or out of normal practice. So ethical approval will be required. Where the ethical approval is will depend on where you work. So if you're using and approaching NHS patients, then it's the NREC or the NHS Research Ethics Committee that you would approach and ask for ethical approval, and then the NHS Research and Governance Department or Research and Design departments within those individual trusts that you're then recruiting patients from. If it was social services have something very, very similar. And if it's a non-NHS or non-social services recruitment place, then depending on who you work for, your chances are there'll be some form of ethical approval. That might be at the local university. That might be, first of all, a starting point of that institution, that wherever those patients are. I'm trying to give an example. If you have a sports centre, you want to recruit people who go to that gym, so they're not NHS patients, they're not being recruited or having any contact with the NHS, you'd first of all speak to that gym to ask, are you happy? And then you may ask the local university, if it was a university related thing, for their University Research Ethics Committee approval. If you're not related to university, and if this is not in your clinical NHS capacity, then theoretically, I don't know what you would do, if I'm honest. I'd probably ask the National Research Ethics Committee, the NHS committee, what their view of it was. Because gut feeling says there should be some form of approval, but I'm not sure who you'd go to. But anyway, that's a potential CAHPR meeting of the future. Anyway, finally, there's the 3 points which I think are a bit of a grey area currently. And so we have anonymised data analysis. So this could be you could have a data set that you've gathered of previous patients, and it's in this Excel document, and you've always collected this data routinely, and it's anonymised. What do you do with that? Okay, and they're very similar to case reports. So it might be that you look through patients' NHS records, okay, and extracted data from their notes, or you've looked at their X-rays as well. Okay, so the patients haven't done anything different. This is just normal routine practice. You're not asking them to do anything different. They will probably not be aware that you're doing this at all. But you wouldn't routinely look at their notes to then publish. You wouldn't routinely look at their X-rays to do that. You wouldn't routinely analyse their data, potentially. Now, some people would say, well, if you wanted to look at your service and work out is your service working or not for a commissioners, well, you would do that. You know, you would look and evaluate. It's a service evaluation. And the service evaluation versus research versus audit is a Venn diagram of greyness. Okay. There are now ethical review stages with the NHS ethics review called proportional review. So there is not a mini review, but it's an abbreviated ethics review for particularly notes and X-ray reviews. So you can provide information about what you're intending to do with this data, how it's going to be handled, and how it's going to be presented to the NHS Ethics Committee, and they'll go, yes, that's fine, that's not a problem. So it's not a full-scale, let's do a massive great ethics committee document, but it is still checking that what you're proposing to do is appropriate use. The benefit of that is that when you come to submit the paper, you can put, this has been reviewed by this committee with a reference number, which is a really comforting thing to be able to do, because the last thing you want to do is submit your paper that you spent the last year on, and then for the journal to go, look, this is unethical, there's no ethics. So, how to write? So I sat down and I tried to answer this question. I went to Twitter, which I often do, and asked for guidance, and Twitter said reporting guidelines, which is absolutely right. So for nearly all the papers that you could possibly write, there is guidance on what information you should have within your paper. The benefit of these reporting guidelines is they give you structure, and it means that you can't miss things. And again, if you look at the reporting guidelines, which we'll go through in a moment, really early on, then it makes you think about, well, what things do I need to make sure that I've done or got to be able to truly answer my question and report that in the literature. So the EQUATOR Network this is the website link, is a network really where their objective is to improve the reporting of studies, so that if you pick up a paper, then you've got all the answers within that paper, within that 3,000 words, to give you the information that you need. And there are various different reporting guidelines. So if we see here, probably the 4 most common ones is PRISMA for systematic reviews, CONSORT for randomized controlled trials, CAHPR, which is the case report EQUATOR recommendation of reporting, and then SQUIRE, which I'd never come across SQUIRE before, but I quite like SQUIRE, it sounds good, which is the equivalent for quality improvement studies. And what they all do really clearly, usually over 20 to 30 items, is something like this. So this is the example for case studies. This is CAHPR, and we can see the expectation in the titles and the keywords and the abstracts, the introduction, and throughout the paper, what information would we expect to see there. Okay, so it really helps you structure and think about what content do we need. So when you then marry up the thinking about what journal you're thinking in mind with your reporting guidelines, you can bring them together. A number of journals now also ask for the guideline to be submitted with the paper, and for you to clearly state where within your paper you've met that guideline. Okay. So if you submit a systematic review to a number of journals now, that will be the expectation. Now what that does, if you've done as I've just recommended, which, as you write your paper you use this, then it's easy. But if you write your paper and then come to this, then what it really nicely highlights are the gaps, because there's nowhere to escape. Okay, so try to avoid that, because then otherwise you end up trying to go back and fill in the gaps, and it all looks a little bit haphazardous. So as you're writing, have a copy of your reporting guideline there, and then the computer there, so you can see and make sure you meet them. The other thing, if we take the example, I suppose, of PRISMA, which is a reporting guideline for systematic reviews, one of the first things is this systematic review registered? Okay, have you registered it on a database, for instance? So even before you start writing, even really early on your design, if you register that, then you've met that there. If you first look at this when you've written your paper, then you've missed the boat. Okay, you can't register a systematic review once you've written the thing, so you always end up with a not done or empty gap. Okay, so that the editor, before they send it out to peer review, will look at that and go, oh, they're missing that bit, that bit, that bit. Actually, let's not go here. Let's not send it out to peer review. We'll ask them to send it somewhere else, or we'll revise it or something like that. Okay, so look at that really early. Really, really early is helpful. Author guidelines. So when you're writing your paper, again, you know your journal because you made that decision really, really early on. You've got the author guidelines, and some people feel that the author guidelines are almost like recommendations. It's like, okay, I'll do what I want to do, but I'll sort of do most of these. I disagree with that. I'd say do what they ask. Okay, make sure your paper does exactly what's there. It's really easy for the editor, when they screen through your paper, to say, I'm not going to send it out to peer review because actually you don't format the references correctly, or you haven't submitted the paper with a separate title page. Okay, don't give the editor and the reviewers any excuse not to send your paper out to peer review. Okay, do exactly what they want. Okay, the slightly frustrating thing is that each journal is slightly different. Okay, so they'll ask for slightly different formats. They'll ask for different types of references. So say your paper has been rejected 2-3 times. It's that rigmarole of having to go and reformat and do that. But it is worth the effort to do that. Okay. Again, as I said, don't give your reviewer any opportunity not to accept your paper. So the key thing really, I suppose, is in point 2. So when we said early on about thinking about journal, does the paper that you're designing, that you've written, does it fit with the remit? Does it fit with the readership or not? So each journal will have a broad mission statement, or a description of what their aims and objectives are and the type of people who read that. Does your paper sit with that? And one way is to look at the guidelines, that will tell you. The other thing is to look at the types of papers that they've published before. Okay, does the topic come up again and again and again? Because it makes sense that if they've published on this topic before, they must be interested in it. So it gives you a good chance to say, okay, this meets it quite nicely. The categories are the types of papers, so that could be opinion piece, that could be brief report, that could be a short report, that could be a case study. The words can sometimes vary, but again, within the author's guidelines, there'll be a brief description about the type of papers. Some journals will like, for instance, they'll like systematic reviews. They might not like literature reviews. Other journals might like the literature review version. It fit your journal to fit your paper, really. As we said before, format your paper so it looks like the type of paper that you've got there. So little things like if they have bold capital letters for each of their introduction, methods, results, discussion section, then you do that. If they don't use subheadings, don't use subheadings. If they do use subheadings, use the same subheadings that they always publish those types of papers in, so that the editor, the reviewers go, oh yeah, this looks like a paper, that'll fit, great, let's send it on type thing. Word count, don't ignore it. Again, it's another thing that the reviewers and the editor will say, actually, we're not going to take it to peer review. If they've specified a word count, make sure it meets that word count. Even if it means that you spent hours, weeks, months on a paragraph and you have to take it out, take it out. Or can you make it abridge the version slightly? Or if you really can't, don't submit it to that journal. Go to a different journal. If you really can't meet within the word count, then actually don't try to do that. If you think, actually, no, the paper really, really has to have a chance at this journal, but I can't meet within the word count, then in your covering letter say, I acknowledge I haven't met the word count, I'm 500 words over, but actually I think this is the right journal for my paper for this, and this reason. Okay? So if you really can't, make it, be upfront and say, look, that's the case. Formatting, as I said, format exactly how they want. Now, journals are changing slightly. So some journals now aren't so particular on the formatting for references, for instance. So some journals say, actually, reference whichever way you want, just be consistent. Other journals will be like, no, we want you to reference in the Harvard or the Vancouver way with superscript numbers or numbers in brackets. It will vary. Do whatever they recommend. Okay? Don't try to go against the system, play the game in a way. Don't give them any opportunity to bounce the paper back for that reason. And finally, the covering letter. If I'm absolutely honest, I didn't take the covering letter game seriously enough until about a year ago. And then someone went, well, you've spent a fair bit of time on the covering letter. And I was like, no, I've just been polite and said, this is our paper. If you've got any questions, then say. I was making a big mistake. So the covering letter is everything now. So when you've written your paper, your covering letter, which is only half a side of A4, a side of A4 tops, is almost your shop window to sell your paper. So your editor's going to look at that. The review team, when the paper comes in, will first look at that, and they'll then go, okay, should we send this paper out to peer review? That paragraph about why your paper needs to go to that journal, why it's really important to the readership of this journal, why this is going to change practice or change viewpoints or really change whatever in your field, that needs to go in the covering letter. Because then the reviewer will go, okay, the editorial team will go, okay, that's a fair point, we'll send it out. And particularly for the bigger journals where, as we'll talk about the peer review process for that, they might get hundreds of submissions a week. They need to choose, and your covering letter is your way to really stand out. Okay, so I spend a bit more time than 3 minutes on my covering letter than I used to. Okay, but yeah. So timescales and frameworks. So there is no right and a wrong, and it will vary massively on the type of paper you're writing. Okay, hugely. So your case report, your opinion piece might take a lot less time than your systematic review, or might take a lot less time than your trial, for instance. So it'll all vary what you're reporting. But first of all, prepare your material. Think of your question, identify your journal, and then once you've got those in place and you've got the material you need to start answering that question, then draft your paper. Constantly approach your collaborators and your co-authors. Use them. Okay, any questions, any uncertainty, any section you're really being challenged on writing. Use them to give their advice. And then the big gap is revise it, revise it, revise it, and revise it. Okay, and that could take anywhere between a week to 2 years. Okay, you might spend a month on a paragraph because it goes from the 3 reviewers, let's say, from 3 authors, it might go around the houses again and again and again and again. I remember spending a month on 2 sentences because we just quite couldn't get it right, and we argued over 2 sentences. In hindsight, it seems ridiculous, but it was worth it in the end. But spend the time on that. format for the journal once you're happy with the paper, and then review and submit. Okay. As I said, the key thing is making sure that all your collaborators are happy and that you're happy with the output. Only once you're happy with the output, then you should submit. Okay? Never submit and you're thinking, oh, I'm not sure, or I wish I spent a bit more time on. Never submit and hope. Always feel really comfortable that actually this is the best it's ever going to get. Let's send it out now. Okay? Because if you're not 100% happy, then it will get bounced, or if it doesn't get bounced and it gets accepted there and then, you'll always see it in print and go, I wasn't quite happy with that, and that's the last thing you want to do. Okay, that's your shop window. People will know you for that paper, so make sure that you're 100% happy with that paper. So, final few slides around peer review process. So, there's 3 assessments of your peer review process for nearly all journals now. So first of all, you prepare your paper and you submit it off, all now electronically. When I started, we used to have to do like 10 copies and staple and then put it in the post, and then you'd send it off somewhere, and it cost a fortune in postage, and it was crazy. And now you just press an email, it's like, oh, done, fantastic, or you put it on the platform. So you send your paper off online. It then goes to the editorial office, and usually it will be reviewed by one of the administratory team that will check that actually your submission is complete, that you have the paper, the title page that is either separate or included, that you have all the figures, everything you're referring to is in there. They might also check that you've met the author guidelines, you've put the word count, you've formatted the paper correctly. So those technical aspects they'll check, and if they aren't all there, he, she will bounce it back to you to say, can you please amend this, okay? Because it isn't formatted yet correctly. Once it's formatted correctly, then it will then be reviewed by someone on the editorial team. And depending on the journal will depend on who the editorial team person is. So that could be the main editor-in-chief, that could be one of the associate editors, or that could be an editorial panel. So if we take the examples of the Lancet, the BMJ, larger journals, every week they'll have an editorial team review and they'll go through the submissions. So they'll look at that covering letter, they'll look at the paper very briefly, and they'll say which ones do we recommend go off to peer review and which ones don't. Okay, so that really emphasises the importance of that abstract and that covering letter to sell themselves to those journals. What the editorial office will do is, first of all, they'll look at the clinical relevance to that journal. They'll look at, is this appropriate for our readership? That's the first question. Does it fit within our remit? If it does fit within our remit, then is it novel? Is it important? Is it going to be a valuable addition to knowledge? They're the 2 questions. If they fit those 2 aspects, then the paper will then be submitted to peer review. Okay, so the associate editor or the editor will make a decision about, okay, it's this paper, this is the topic, we'll send it out to 2 or more people to give their independent view on the strengths and weaknesses of that paper. Okay, if it doesn't meet remit, if it isn't new and novel, then they'll just reject it before it goes to peer review. So usually within a week or so you'll know about whether it's gone to peer review or not. If it does go to peer review, then that associate editor or editor has made a decision about the 2 or more people that they want to review it, and hopefully they'll choose somebody who knows about that topic and or knows about that methodology or that design, be that case reports, be that systematic reviews, be that clinical trials, whatever. So that the editor will then get their comments to make an independent assessment based on those comments about the merits of this paper. Is there enough there to justify a decision on whether the paper should be accepted or not? Okay. So the peer review comments really will come into various outcomes, but they'll either be rejection. So this paper might have merit, but actually there's things that can't be changed that mean that it isn't suitable for this particular journal. It might be accept with major amendments, and probably most papers that will fit in. So okay, we think it's valid, it's useful for the readership, there is something here, but actually you need to improve the reporting, or there's something you're missing, or could you do another analysis in addition to that, or have you thought about discussing the implications of this in the discussion? Something that needs, some thoughts that might take anywhere between a week or 3 months to do. Okay. The next thing is minor amendments. So yes, acceptance with minor amendments. Yep, we like it. There's just a few things you need to change. So have you thought about adding in a few sentences about this? Or there might be some typos. Or could you consider this particular limitation and put that in the discussion? So again, the sort of things that would take up to 4 weeks to do, anywhere between 1 day or an afternoon to 4 weeks, depending on the extent of that. Or full acceptance. So sometimes you'll submit a paper, it'll go to peer review, and they'll say, yes, it's perfect, fits the bill, wonderful, you've done everything, we can't find any problems, yet we'll accept it straight away. Okay? And they're the ones that you want, because it's like, actually, I think it's a good paper, I don't want to see it ever again, because I've spent the last 2 years of my life on it. Wonderful, it's found a home, let's get the message out. So that period of time between the first decision, one of those 4 options, can be anywhere between 2 hours, which is basically it's gone to the editorial team said no, it's not really for us, or it might take anywhere up to 6 to 12 months. There's been one of my papers has been knocked on to 14 months, which is a problem when it was a systematic review. So your search strategy all of a sudden becomes quite outdated, even before you've actually got the results. It shouldn't take that long. Usually you can anticipate this whole period to the first decision should take anywhere between 4 to 8 weeks, really. Okay? I'm an associate editor, and we give our reviewers 3 weeks to get their feedback. Then I will get the paper back with their comments, and it will usually take me a week or so to come back with a decision. So we hope to be able to give the authors 4 to 5 weeks until they get a decision. Okay. So yeah, we talked about outcomes, so they might vary between rejection to amendment to acceptance. So if it is one of the, we like it but we want you to do some changes, then it's really important that you address those changes, or if you don't make those changes, that you've got a jolly good reason for not doing that. So those peer reviewers and that editorial team have said, okay, we want you to do these changes, or we recommend these changes. So you'll have a list of recommendations, itemise them, okay? So break them by item and say, this is query number 1, this is what we did. Query number 2, this is what we did. Query number 3, this is what we did, okay? For the this is what we did, make it clear where in your paper you've done that. Okay? So that's important for 2 reasons. One, it's very important because it means that the editorial team and the reviewers can see that you've taken them seriously and they feel valued, because usually their comments are really quite useful and hopefully are there to improve the paper. But also, it makes it a lot easier for that reviewer to re-review the papers, because they'll usually read through the whole paper but focus just on the bits that you've changed. Okay? So some reviewers will just look at that. Because what you don't really want is a reviewer to review your paper, to come up with some recommendations, and then for them to come up with some more recommendations at a later point. Okay? That's, as an author, I find that really frustrating, because it's like, I did everything you wanted, and now you want me to do more, so I have to wait another 6 weeks to do that. Okay? So make it easy for them, that they can see where you've taken those points on board. Sometimes you'll disagree with their points. Okay? Sometimes you'll say, look, I'm not doing that, and there'll be a very good reason for why you're not doing that. That might be because you haven't got the data. That might be because you fundamentally disagree with that author, because we're all human beings and we like to academically agree and disagree. But if you do have that case, then say, in a very diplomatic, nice way, thank you very much, it's a really useful comment. However, we aren't doing this because of this reason, okay? And try to justify that reason up. If it is the case where they want you to include more data that you haven't got, then again, say in that itemised bit, look, that's a very important point. unfortunately we didn't collect that data, because if you didn't collect it, you can't magic up numbers. But it might be that in your limitation section you say, whilst this paper does this, we didn't look at this. That could be an area for further study. Okay. So again, what you're doing is you're highlighting to the author, to the reviewer, sorry, that was a good point, and actually I've included it into this paper. And it's important because if they've raised it, chances are the reader will also think the same thing as well. So again, it improves your argument for that. So itemize the changes, itemize in text, and a lot of journals will ask you to do that anyway, and track changes or line out where those amendments are made. As I said, usually, and I have to admit, as an author, 9 times out of 10 will do whatever they ask. Usually, I like to please people. So with the reviewers, I will try to satisfy the reviewers' comments, unless there's something I really can't do, and then I'll say that. Other people like to have a little academic discussion, and will say, no, I'm not doing that because I didn't want to do it. You play devil's advocate then, because they might hate you, or they might go, actually, fair enough, I can see his point. I don't take the risk, but yeah, others do. You do whatever is right for you. But yeah, highlight the changes if you can in track changes or some way, so it makes it easier for that reviewer. So once you revise your paper, usually, and as an editor, associate editor, I would always send that paper to the same reviewers who did it the first time, because again, the last thing that you want as an author is it to go to someone fresh, because that reviewer will usually say, okay, I'll read it from a first point of call, I've got to come up with something because they've asked me to review it, and then I'll make life slightly more challenging, or actually there's a different viewpoint. So you end up, or not at square one, but you could end up with a load more comments that you didn't initially have. Whereas if it goes to the same reviewers, they've had ownership, they know about that paper, they've read it once before, they've made their comments, they can see whether you've addressed those comments or not, so that would be highly appropriate to do that. So you're hoping it goes to the same reviewer. If it's minor amendments, then it might not go back to the peer reviewers, it might actually just go to the editorial team. They'll check that the amendments have been made. So if you've itemised that, it makes it even easier for the editorial team, and they might then make the decision to accept it at that point. But sometimes you will have, okay, thank you for making those changes, you haven't quite done this, or could you revisit that? And where you think there's a point that you might not have addressed, but you think, okay, this reviewer really feels quite strongly about that, then say in your responses to those comments, okay, we haven't done this, but if the reviewer and the editorial team feel very strongly about this, we will reconsider. Because that almost means that you're leaving the door slightly open, because the last thing you want is it really to be rejected after a major amendments have been done. But yeah, they might ask you for further amendments. The slightly demoralising thing is when you do major amendments, so they've accepted it with major amendments, you do your changes and then it then gets rejected because you think, I was so close, they liked it, but obviously I didn't do enough to get that final part. That sometimes happens, when you get that letter saying we'd like you to do these changes, they'll always say this does not guarantee acceptance. So it rarely happens, but it sometimes happens. So sometimes expect to get further comments and further changes. If they've asked for changes after changes, it means that actually they want to persevere with this paper. They really like this paper. They think there's merit in this paper. So it's promising, even though it might be time-consuming for you. It's promising as a long-term outcome. I, as an author and an editor, take the be nice to the reviewers and editors approach. Some people don't. I recently finished a project with a colleague of mine who was really not diplomatic and was all for telling this reviewer exactly what they thought of them, and we had to really calm down the situation, because that's not going to help anyone. It's not professional. It wasn't an AHP. I'm not going to say anything more because I'm being recorded. But be nice, because actually it's very professional. And as we all know in healthcare, the world is a very small place, and it's worth not offending people or upsetting people, because it won't help you in the long term. And also, I truly believe reviewers and editors are there to support and help writers get the best output, because at the end of it, we want research to change practice. So their role is to ensure that the message is clear and is useful for the reader. So I think that's, they're not enemies, even though it might feel like it when they reject your work. They're actually there to help and not hinder. So post-peer review, so if unsuccessful, don't feel demoralised, okay? In this game, you will be rejected, okay? And you will develop a thick skin, but expect rejection, because you won't always get rejected, okay? But perseverance is really important. So the number of people who write their first paper, it gets rejected, and then leave it, you know, I'd really encourage them to say, don't, keep on. It just means that that journal didn't like it, but there will be a home for your paper. And I say it to everybody, every paper has a home. It's just finding that home, okay? So resubmit, but if it got rejected, there'll be comments. There'll be reasons why it got rejected. They might be editorial comments, they might be the peer review comments. Use those comments. Because chances are, if those comments are being raised by those reviewers, they will be raised again by a different group of reviewers, okay? So address them as much as you can, then resubmit. So yeah, don't ignore that feedback. If you're successful, then fantastic, celebrate. So your first paper is the best feeling ever, fact. And then it still continues to get exciting. So celebrate, but what you'll get is you'll get pretty quickly nowadays the proofs. So the paper that it looks like. So you'll submit a Word version. The proofs will be sent anywhere between 3 days to 3 weeks, and that will be what the paper is going to look like. So that's quite an exciting thing to see your name in lights and what it looks like. Review that proof, okay? Because once you accept that proof, you can do nothing about it, okay? So make sure that all the figures and all the tables are there. Make sure that the text is clear. Make sure that they spelt your name right. That's really important. And they've affiliated your department to the correct place, okay? Make sure that you're happy with it. If you're not happy with it, tell them, okay? If the figure's a bit blurry, or the photo doesn't look quite right, or it's not in the right place, tell them, okay? Because if you don't tell them, you can't change it after that, okay? So do that. A lot of people almost take it as read that the proofreading has done, you know, they're experts, they type up and they make it all the time. Don't, you know, they're very, very good, but make sure that you're happy. It's very important, because again, as I said, that's the shop window. That's your name on it. That represents you to the world. It's now typical for most papers to be online first. So if your paper gets accepted, it's not unusual for actually it to be online within 2-3 weeks of it being accepted now. Whereas before, you'd get your paper accepted and you would never see it until about a year later when it was in the paper version. Now it's a lot quicker, okay? Which is great, it's fantastic. And then your paper will be online, so people can access it, they can read it, they can use it, but then the print version of that, where it's attributed to a particular edition of that journal, might be a year later, okay? So, but in a way nowadays that doesn't matter too much because they can all access it online, okay? But yeah. So dissemination, so last slide or two. So they say that every paper that's published, only 15 to 20 people will ever read that work. So if you spent 6 years of your life on this one paper, potentially only 15 people will ever read it, which I find really soul-destroying, okay? You've put blood, sweat and tears into that. You want more than 15 people to look at it because you think it's really important. You've decided, I'm going to put the energy into this because I think it can have an impact on care, on human beings. That's why we do it. We don't do it just for the fun of it. We do it to change humans, to improve life generally. So spread that message. And now with the advent of social media, with the advent of communications, you can spread that message across the world instantaneously. Use Twitter, use Facebook, use whatever the social media platforms of the future are to spread that message. Okay, really, really important. As I said right from the onset, you thought that important. So, a speech and language therapist in Australia might find that important. Nowadays, you can tell them via the power of the internet. Okay, so use that. Send paper copies to your service lead and commissioners. Okay, so again, promote your service, promote what you've done. Show that you're a dynamic team. Send those publications. They really impress people. Okay, give them a copy. Show them actually, you're forward-facing, that you want to change practice, and this is the tangible evidence to prove that. ensure that your department know about it, okay? So if you've spent time looking at this particular area and it's going to change your practice, well, tell your colleagues about it, because then it could change their practice, okay? And that really presses the impact of your results on service so that you can use your findings. As I said, push on social media, lots and lots. Big fan of that now, really important. Do service users need to know? So it might be that you do a project and you find something. Well then, could it be useful if you put it in sort of a lay summary post that's in the waiting area, for instance? Or put it on the website for so it's plain accessible to everybody. If you pick up a Cochrane review nowadays, you will see the scientific abstract, but you also see the plain English language, the plain language summary, which summarises exactly what they found so that anyone can pick it up. So I know nothing about ENT, but I could go on to the Cochrane review about grommets, for instance, and can read the plain language summary and I'll understand what they're trying to say and what the message is. So it might be for your message, get that across to the people that's going to make an impact to, be that whatever walk of life. And for some instances, use the media. So if wherever you work, you will have a communications office, you will have a publicity office. If you've done a project that's changed or you've documented a service, okay, they'll happily help you and push you if they think actually this is, it's really novel, it's interesting. Yeah, I can see the spin. People in the community would like to know about this. It sells, our hospital, our unit, our health system off in a really good light. Tell them, they'll love it. They really, really like that. Okay, particularly if it's going to have a difference to the whole of that community. So make the most of the effort you put in. So finally, top tip. So if you haven't got the impression, do it. I think publication is massively important for you as healthcare professionals, for your services, but most importantly for patients. I think it's the lever to be able to change lots of things, and so use it. Identify your journal really early. Use your team. Don't be scared to use your team. Choose people that you know are going to work. Okay, so don't choose people that you think, okay, they're not, they're going to read through it once and that's it, or they're too busy. They're not going to. Choose people who are going to help you. Structure and report your papers using reporting guidelines. Satisfy the author guidelines, really important. Revise it. There's nothing more demoralising as a reviewer of papers where they can't spell trial, they put trail, and it's just like, oh come on, that's really, it's easy because spell check misses it, but it shows that actually if they haven't gone to the trouble to check that, then that doesn't fill you with confidence, and it's given me another reason not to like this paper. So don't let me not like your paper. If you are unsuccessful the first time, or the second time, or the third time, or the fourth time, keep on persevering. You will find that home, okay? But every time it gets rejected, if it gets rejected a number of times, you will get feedback to that, and look at that feedback and use that feedback. Most importantly, when it is accepted, and it will be at some point, enjoy it. Okay, because it's a lot of hard work, but make the most of that and spread that message to the people that are going to make the difference. So where now? So think about it, talk to your team, talk about opportunities with clinical academics in your department, because it might be that either in a clinical department there's clinical academics, or in your local university, if you're interested in doing this sort of thing and you're willing to roll up your sleeves and give a pair of hands, helping hands, most people will be overjoyed that there's someone who's interested in their field and is interested to help as well. So if you're interested, then find out the people who are doing these sorts of things and say, look, is there any way I could help, or have you thought about that? It's a really good starting point so you can see the process and see what's involved. And then when you've got that experience, then you can lead those things. Or you can just say, actually, I'm going to lead it and do it myself, and then I can tap into other people as I go. So whatever. Use us as well from a CAHPR point of view, because we can help with that linkage as well. So it might be that you go, okay, I really want to look at this topic, but I don't know anyone who does that and that. And it might be that I know, or I know someone who would know, so use that. Or it might be within